Okay, so I'll introduce you to Davide Grasso, who is a militant, intellectual, an author. He has published 4 books. New York, Regina Underground, in 2013. Then he published 2 books about his experience in the YPG in northern Syria, which he joined in 2016. Evalen, perché sono andato a combattere l'ISIS, why I decided to fight ISIS. The second book is called Il fiore del deserto, which is about the experience of women in northern Syria. And the last book, which is the subject of today's event, is a book about the Berlin Wall, right? It's called, you can find it on the table, it's called the City and the Città del Fantasma, the City and the Ghost. Okay, so I would say that a good way to kind of discuss this book is to ask 3 very major questions to Davide, and we'll try to answer them. Then we'll open the floor and we'll take questions from the public. I think the core idea of the book is to look at the new walls by looking at the Berlin walls, or the other way around. By the time, in the 90s and still today, there were celebrations about the end of the war, but at the same time, many walls were being built and are still being built all over the world. So the question, I guess, is what connects, if you can explain what connects the Berlin Wall to the new walls. What's the kind of link between these structures?
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for being here, and I'd like to thank you, especially the K-Fetisch, for hosting this event. Well, yes, the book was published exactly on November 9th, 2019, so the 30th anniversary of the opening of the Berlin Wall 30 years ago. And what has the Berlin Wall in common with the new walls that are now dividing and separating countries and nations in the world? Is more things than could be expected, in fact. But the first relation between the Berlin Wall and the new walls is that the new walls are so many, and they all were constructed after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is the paradox. I grew up basically, as probably also some of you, in the epoch of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the civilization that basically was justified also ideologically in relation to that event. And the rhetoric of the governments and the media in the 90s and also afterwards was very much this is the new era of freedom or the end of history, and especially an era very different from the previous one that was characterized by the existence of this iron curtain of the Berlin Wall especially. The fact that, especially in this 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall, coincides with an explosion, basically, of construction of new walls throughout the world, also brought the analysis on a new level. In the 10th anniversary in 1999, of course, no one spoke about the new walls. There were already some, and we will talk about that. But also in 2009, even if the walls of the new century were already an important phenomenon, it was not so relevant as it is now. So now, even the mainstream commentators begin to address this issue, but especially I think the most critical viewers of the actual situation must address this issue. we all know that, especially after 2015 and the big migrant stream toward Europe through the Balkan route, Europe has been covered by wars, especially from Greece. That is the first country in 2011 that began to construct a wall at the border with Turkey, and Bulgaria that began in 2014 to build its own wall at the border with Turkey. But then also Croatia and Hungary at the border with Serbia and Slovenia as well. And also even Austria at the border with Hungary built a wall at the main gate between the two countries, but also in 2016 made up a project that makes the Austrian government able to build a wall that would cover the whole extent of the border with Hungary in 48 hours if needed. And then there is also the two walls between Macedonia and Serbia, and also actually the wall between Ukraine and Russia, Estonia and Russia, Latvia and Russia, and even Norway and Russia. So it is an extent of the construction of walls between the border of the European nations that is much more actually extended than one would think. And then there is the Middle East that is also covered by wall. Not just the famous wall that encircles the West Bank, Palestine, and also enter inside the territory of the West Bank, built by Israel since 2002, and the other barrier that encircles Gaza, and also the wall that Israel constructed at the border with Egypt to stop the migrants from Africa to enter the country. And also, by the way, the wall that Egypt itself built at the border with Gaza, so with Palestine, to basically prevent Palestinians to come to Egypt. But there are many other walls that are less famous in the Middle East. For example, the wall between Turkey and Syria, especially related to Rojava in northern Syria, that is a wall against migrants, but it's also a political wall, a wall against the revolution, against the militant revolutionary movement, the socialist movement in Rojava in northern Syria. And also, for example, the 2,000 and more or less 500 kilometers wall between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the one between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, the wall that Iran constructed in Balochistan at the border with Pakistan, even between Iraq and Syria, there are parts of the border that is also interested by a barrier, and between Jordan and Iraq, Jordan and Syria, there are walls, very technological walls by the way. Between Saudi Arabia and Iraq, there is a huge barrier, electronic iron barrier. And one could continue in saying, for example, that India is a country that nowadays is the more fortified in as far as borders are concerned. So the border between India and Bangladesh especially is completely walled up, and with the most advanced technological and military equipment, and the same for the border between India and Nepal, and India and Pakistan, of course, in Kashmir. And there is a wall between China and North Korea. There is a wall between Myanmar and Thailand. And one could continue. There are walls in Africa between Zimbabwe and the neighboring country, or in South America between Ecuador and neighboring countries. And of course, then there are the most famous walls. The wall, for example, between the United States and Mexico, that has a long history, and basically, by the way, began its construction under George H.W. Bush, Ms. Bush Sr., in 1990, which means exactly in the months when the Berlin Wall was disrupted and the different segments of the Berlin Wall were also sold or given as a present to the Vatican or to the CIA, or anyway the physical wall in Berlin was exported. In those same months, the United States began to build the so-called tortilla wall, the wall between San Diego and Tijuana. It is the first section of more or less 100 kilometers to prevent the illegal immigration from Mexico, that then under Bill Clinton and especially George W. Bush would become a very long and extensive construction. And I don't want to also miss the very important walls that are often forgotten in Ceuta and Melilla, the two enclaves of Spain in Moroccan territory. It might seem not that important, but in fact are very important because they were built in 93 in Ceuta and in 96 in Melilla. So again, in the 90s, in the beginning of these 30 years of new walls after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And they were so important because these two enclaves, of course, stem from the colonial period of Spanish domination in northern Africa and the subsequent treaties between Spain and Morocco, basically prevent the whole African population to enter Europe from the only two possible pedestrian territorial ways. That's why. That's because these two walls in Ceuta and Melilla are existent. Then all the migrants from Africa have to go through the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore there have been so many thousands of deaths in these 30 years in the Mediterranean, and as well as, for example, the reason why there have been thousands of deaths of migrants from that were trying from Mexico to enter the United States is not for the most part for the shootings by the boarding patrol of the United States or for the beatings and tortures by the police of California, but it's mainly because the section of the border that are covered by wall basically makes it necessary for all the migrants and refugees to go through the Arizona desert and then to have an even worse death, because then there is the natural wall that, as the Mediterranean between Africa and Europe, the desert between Mexico and the US, has unfortunately this role of a natural border, which is deadly as much or even more than the human walls. What is the relationship? The relationship in the first place is that all these new walls basically are not confirming the rhetoric following which, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, freedom has been established in the world, equality or human rights are respected, and this is something very relevant. I would like to underline, for example, that Angela Merkel made a speech in the last 9th of November that is using the same rhetoric that would be used 10 or 20 years ago. Nothing changed. Even the president of the Italian Republic, Mattarella, said, commenting the 30th anniversary of the Berlin Wall, no more limitation to the freedom of travel. There will never be again limitation of the freedom of travel. And this is the president of the Italian Republic, which, as you all know, played a specific role in this last year also in being the gate in the sense of the wall, actually, especially the natural wall between Africa and Europe. But there are also other relationships. I will be short because we don't have much time, but I would say two. For example, the main difference between the Berlin Wall and the new walls is that the Berlin Wall was constructed by a state or a system of states in order to prevent the population to get out of that territory and to emigrate in other countries. Whereas, of course, the new walls are mainly, with very few exceptions, constructed to prevent people to come in, and are constructed by the arrival states, not by the departure states. But at the same time, we see today that there is a certain level of agreement between the partner states and the rival states in the management of the migratory phenomena. This is, for example, the case of the deals between the European Union and Turkey, but also the deals between Italy and Libya, or even Italy and Niger, where by specific laws or diplomatic relations, the two countries are basically sharing the responsibility of how taking control of the movement of the population. And the rhetoric of the governments of the partner states is actually very similar to the one of the rival states. If you see the rhetoric of the government of Libya about migrants, is absolutely the same of the far right in Italy. And that is also, by the way, the same case, for example, for the South African government, the Mozambique government, or other governments in Africa that are anyway having the same racist rhetoric and advocating for the constructions of walls at their border to prevent migration. And this is a similarity with the Berlin Wall, because as I told in the book, in the beginning of my book, I tried to reconstruct the events of the construction of the Berlin Wall that are portrayed like it was, of course, a choice of the Soviet Union, and Nikita Khrushchev especially had a big role of basically supporting the idea of Walter Ulbricht to build this wall. But it's also less known that actually the reaction of the American administration, especially John Kennedy, was absolutely not negative to this solution. And the reaction of that same day when Kennedy was informed that the Volkspolizei began to construct a barrier in the middle of Berlin was, okay, this is a good solution actually. It's not the perfect solution, but it's a good solution. It's better than a war. And anyway, Khrushchev could not allow anymore all these people to get out of the German Democratic Republic, because that would completely mean the collapse of the economy. And this is interesting because this also shows that when, in fact, economical factors are concerned, and especially the control of the labor force, then even if apparently different systems have the same mentality and understand each other, understand the basic need, the sovereign need of the capital to control the labor force and its movements. And this is the first similarity. I would say just the second and last one, historically, is that we should never forget that the Berlin Wall was basically the first wall constructed against humans and against refugees, because in the history of the humankind, normally walls were military structures, from the Great Wall of China to the Adrian Wall, up to the Atlantic Wall of Hitler, or the Maginot Line between France and Germany, and we could continue. I mean, the medieval castle, whatever example you make throughout history, walls were constructed for military goals. But the Berlin Wall had not this goal. Apparently, with the definition of anti-fascistische Schutzwall, there was this very vague referring to a threat from the outside, but we know that was just again, ideological rhetoric, and the reality was that it was a wall against refugees. And this is again a similarity with the new walls. So basically the Berlin Wall started this history of walls that are constructed to control people, to define who has the right or who hasn't the right to cross a certain border, and this is what is continuing today.
Thank you. Some people are standing. Maybe you can find a seat here. Feel free to come over here. So the book is also about the collapse of the so-called Eastern Bloc, right? And I think the book points out that there's something that the left, the European left at least, possibly not only the European left, has a tendency to forget or to neglect 1989, which is an absolutely crucial day, not only because of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, but also because of the wave of independent states that emerged following 2 years, basically, up until 1991. And I think, Davide, maybe you could tell us something about your perspective on this date from a leftist perspective.
Yes, in fact, this is the main reason why I decided to work on this subject. And I must tell you that in Italy, when I present this book, there are not so few people that actually ask me why you decided to write a book about the Berlin Wall and this, which is, I think, a bizarre question, because of course it is a major event. Of course, it's a major event, especially for socialists, especially for those who are trying to think something different for our society. Because it is a defeat for a certain movement, the communist movement, which is very significant in the recent history, and it is a defeat also for a certain system that the communist movement wields. But it is not just that, and especially the reaction, I think, that there was in these 30 years in the left to the fall of the wall and to the fall of the Soviet Union was very significant. I think we can see two different reactions. The first reaction is the one of the main communist parties of Western Europe, for example, and I'm referring especially to the one of Italy, that took seriously the event of the fall of the wall and what it meant, and transformed itself to a liberal party, a democratic party that is today, for example, in Italy, representing for the electors or for the people. Normally, the party is more representative of the so-called European Union technocracy, and to a neoliberal approach that is completely presented as dogmatic, a dogmatic way to the people. So basically, they took so seriously the shift and event that they say, okay, we welcome communist or socialist now. We will be liberal because liberalism won, and then there is no other way. There is no second possibility. And then we are aware that there is also another tradition, let's say, of the left in the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century that refused this hypothesis of becoming liberal and continued to advocate for a change in society and to a critique of capitalism, and maybe even to the hypothesis of building a communist society in a different way, normally from how the Bolsheviks tried to build a socialist society in Russia and around, or in some cases even with nostalgia for that attempt, and even orthodoxically trying to pursue again the same ideology. But what the second hypothesis of not giving up with the critique of capitalism is united is in the complete removal of the question of '89 and the end and the fall of the Soviet Union. If you see, it's very difficult to find actually books or films or whatever productions by the, let's say, the radical left about the events of the '89 or the '91. I know that saying this in Berlin is a bit different than saying it in Italy, because I'm sure that in Berlin, anyway, there was more attention, of course, to this event. But I can tell you, in Italy, you can find dozens of books about the '68, dozens of books about the '77, also quite a few books about 1917, but no books about '89 or '91 that are written or published by the leftist side of society. And basically the '89 is a matter just for the mainstream media, just for the liberal, how to say, politicians or journalists, or writers or historians. And in general there is this kind of what I call removal. I'm not even sure that it's the right word in English, but I'm referring explicitly to the Sigmund Freud description of the attitude that we might have during dreams, when we have this tendency to remove, to marginalize what is disturbing.
To repress.
To repress what is disturbing. And in fact, if you think of it, it is strange not to speak about what is the most important event in the history of anti-capitalism and communism in history. Maybe after the Russian or Chinese Revolution, the 89 and 91 events is the most important. So why we are not actually discussing about that? Why during these 30 years the radical left didn't discuss very much about that? I think there are many reasons. We can discuss it also tonight. On one side, there are people that think that they are not concerned by those events. Other people that think there was international complot and was not fault of the communist movement, whatever. But the reality is that we actually should speak about this, because that was the beginning of our times. The times we are living in are, of course, defined by also trends, politically, economically, even philosophically, ethically, the perception of the different classes in society that are very much affected by what happened in the time, and or even Europe, even Germany today. What is going on is very much related to what happened at the time, and to basically the discredit that the socialist idea came from the failure of 89, 91. That, of course, stemmed from before, stemmed from very much before, and the book is trying also to, I don't know, from a critical perspective, trying also to give value to the social movements that actually had importance and the strength to actually induce the collapse of a very authoritarian and very extensive system. And I think that if the history of the movements of the West of Europe, of course, is important, we should not, from now on, neglect any longer the importance of the movements of the eastern part of Europe.
But Davide, I think you mentioned while we were talking about this book, one key idea that you think should be discussed, that of nation from a leftist perspective. And if I understood what you meant, you suggested that this kind of shift, this political transition, and the independent states that emerged out of the former Eastern Bloc points out that that we need from the left to kind of reconsider perhaps the idea of nation. And I think your perspective is very much indebted to confederationalism in northern Syria, and how they kind of try to reshape or to kind of reframe the idea of nation and belonging.
Well, yes, in this book I try to show what are also subjectively, in the subjective way, the main actors that played a significant role in destroying the real socialist system. The nationalities are, of course, an important factor. I also tell the story of the working class movement in the Eastern Bloc, which was actually a huge movement, and especially in Poland, achieved a level of self-organization and power that is probably one of the most advanced ever in the history of the working class, as much as the youth. And with youth, I don't mean just students, because of course the students' movement in Pristina, Kosovo, or in Prague, or in Warsaw, Poland, was absolutely significant. Even in Moscow, there were times where students had a role in the dissent. But I'm not referring just to students, also to youth in general, also to youth that were not students, that might be workers, but had a certain attitude toward the institution of the real socialism because they were youth, with a young attitude, with an attitude of refusal that was rooted in a certain youth culture. But yes, it's true, another history that everyone that deals with this subject has to make is the history of the repression of the national sentiment and feeling of the Eastern European populations, and then the expression of this feeling during the decades, not just in '89, but from the revolution in Hungary in '56, going through the the Prague Spring, and of course the demonstrations and uprisings in Poland, but especially in the 80s, basically this wave of vindicating your own national identity brings also to the dark sides of the event that brought to the end of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. I think, for example, about the clashes between Armenians and Azeri in Azerbaijan, or the pogroms that the Uzbeks made against the Turkish minority in Uzbekistan, and other phenomena that happened, especially at the peripheric limits of the Soviet Union, that really created this atmosphere. And we should never forget that '89, that sometimes is told and in a narrative that is completely related to the fall of the Berlin Wall and to the most peaceful and happy aspects of that year. So of course the nation issue is important. What I'm wondering and what I'm posing as a matter of discussion and debate for this book is so what we do in this question of nationality and identity. What is the relationship that a new left, a possible new left, must have with this issue? And this is of course no easy question. Of course, my experience in Syria in this last year inspired me in changing my view somehow, and the theoretical reflection of the Kurdish movement and the confederalist prospect that is also right now put forward by Arabic and Assyrian militants as well in northern Syria, as I said, inspired me in trying to think if it is possible for a progressive, socialist, democratic, revolutionary perspective to also assess anything about the question of nationality. Or if, on the contrary, the question of nationality or the same word of nation is in itself something reactionary, something that must belong, ought to belong only to the right. Of course, if you study the history of the socialist revolutions, you cannot neglect the fact that the repression of the national feeling that was made by the Soviet Union, actually not just in the East European countries, but also in the same big part, at least, of the Soviet Republic, in the end brought the collapse of the system, because we should never forget the economical aspects and political aspects were important to also create the crisis of the Soviet Union. And during the perestroika times, of course, they challenged the government and the party. But what actually brought the Soviet Union to end and to collapse in '91 was the national question. And that seems to suggest that the nation is not something we choose, it's not a subject that we can appreciate or not appreciate, it's just something that the people actually think it is important. And by the way, all this history from Hungary to Czechoslovakia to the Soviet Union during the second part of the 20th century, we should never forget that it's also parallel to the history of anti-colonialism and post-colonialism, so decades in which the idea of nation was not necessarily always related to the fascist use that was done in the first half of the century, but also was used in the sense of gaining independence and self-determination from colonialist power. And it is not by chance that, for example, the revolution in Hungary started in '56, and in '55 was the year of the Bandung Conference, where India and Pakistan and other countries, and China as well, and Yugoslavia as well, tried to draw the perspective of the project of the Third World, or a non-aligned alliance of countries. And this also influenced the Hungarian revolutionaries in taking the streets and saying, okay, then if it is true, and it is true that in '48 there was a human rights declaration by the United Nations that says all nations must be also self-determined, then also Hungary has this right. So it is the whole climate of the second part of the 20th century in which the idea of nation is actually supported and seen as an important question by a lot of peoples throughout the world. And my question is this issue something that a revolutionary perspective can, in this century, the next century, completely set aside, or set aside, or just give to the right as a way to interpret it, to construe it, to elaborate in political terms. I think this would be, of course, risky, or maybe even worse. Like, it is not risky; it's just the reality of right now. What we are seeing is that a lot of people in Europe and elsewhere, beside economical and political and gender claims, also advocate for national claims or identity claims, and we should start a discussion. Probably it's even a bit late to start about what we think of this. And what I think is also studying the history of socialism in Europe is also useful to understand how it is important for people, for common people, for the proletariat, or for the working class, to be free also of express their feeling of belonging to a certain culture, to a certain language, to a certain nation. And my experience in Kurdistan made me more optimistic on the fact that there is also a possible democratic and socialist way to conceive the idea of nation. In fact, the Rojava revolution advocates for a democratic nation that is a nation that is not related to the state, is a non-state nation, is a nation. Idea of nation is against nationalism, against the idea of state itself, and the struggles for the end and collapse, gradual collapse of the state, and the construction of a communist society, but also in advocating for the respect of all the differences, and so also the national differences as much as also the religious sensitiveness that could be in society. And that is another big difference with Bolshevism, that had also another utopia that is like to destroy religion, which also proved to be impossible.
Okay, I think we can take some questions. I think this is a good way to start. You can ask questions in whatever language you prefer, and we'll understand anyone. I think the last point was extremely controversial, and when Davide mentioned it to me, I was like, what?
Thank you for your reflections on the wall and also the nation, and maybe you can continue with your idea of nation and belongingness, because what you didn't mention is you talked about the state, but you didn't mention constitutionalism, constitutions, and if that is something you could consider as a leftist idea, to belong to the constitution, and that the state and the constitution is something that brings people together. I mean, that's the big issue in Germany. We're talking about Verfassungspatriotismus. Instead of national belonging, cultural identity.
Maybe we can gather two questions and then you'll answer them, okay? What the other
No, actually my question is a little bit different, because I read already the book, and in your presentation we're missing very interesting part that you mentioned in the book, and it's about the music, the role of the music during the before the fall of the wall. And my question was, okay, if you can talk a little bit about it, and then my question will be, what's the political role today of music?
As for the constitution issue, I must say that the history of the dissent in the East European countries shows that also another assumption probably of the most radically pragmatic Marxists was wrong. It is, just the so-called structural questions are relevant in order to gather, people in the struggle for a goal, especially actual revolutionary goal. Because in those countries, of course, the economic question was central, and this is not just in Poland, but also in other socialist countries. The exploitation of the working class was very hard, and the political control of the working class was also hard. But it is obvious that also the claim, for example, for the state of law or the respect for the law was important in this movement. And that might sound strange because, of course, we are used to social movements that are mainly criticizing the laws or the strict obedience to the laws. But we should also imagine a society where, imagine the Soviet Union, where the role of the Communist Party, that was, as you know, absolutely central, absolutely important during decades, was basically legitimized in juridical terms with an article in the Constitution, the article number 6, just in 79. So, before that date, all what the Communist Party of the Soviet Union did in the Soviet Union was basically illegal, was something that was not ruled by law. And this is completely consistent with the communist way of conceiving development of society through conflict, and also the role of the Communist Party as basically the avant-garde of the working class that is acting in society and is not the government. Because of course the system was the government on one side, but the party on the other side, it was the actual power. In these conditions and in this situation, of course, there was arbitrary behaviors that could be undertaken by the police officers, for example, or by the political police or the secret services, not just in the Soviet Union, but also in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in East Germany. And basically the feeling of the population was that there was not, transparent rules that could also limit the power, especially of the police forces or the authorities. And in this context, then the claim for civil rights became central. And this is also another parallel that we can make with the post-colonial movements as well. And this is not, in fact, the case of the Western social movement, especially the youth in the Western countries in the 60s and 70s had absolutely not this perspective on the human rights or the abide for the law. But in the East, yes. And so, for example, a very strong struggle that also cost lives and cost a lot of people imprisoned or tortured were actually done for basically imposing to the state to respect its own laws. And if you want, then I can make examples. But it's just to say that, for example, the principles entailed in the Constitution were also a point of reference by the individuals and the groups that struggled in the Soviet Union and in other countries in those times. And in these terms, I would say that also, if we want to ask ourselves in this century again, how we can go over the marginalization that we are affected of, maybe we should also overgo this idea that only economical questions are relevant, and whatever question is also maybe a vindication of the role of the law or vindication of new laws is wrong or is conservative, because it depends, I think, from the context. And that also something that, for example, the struggles in the Middle East also, I'm thinking of Iran, of Palestine, I'm thinking of Turkey, could be an inspiration for. On the other side, the idea of nation again, you asked me to be more specific. Let's say, let's look at Syria. That is in these days the only country that is somehow experiencing such a tragedy that at the same time gathered from all over the world a lot of individuals that went there because they are basically clashing with each other completely different perspectives for the humankind. So you have on one side the fascist perspective from the Syrian regime, on the other side a theocratic perspective supported by the Islamists, and on the other side a socialist democratic perspective supported by the, not just by the Kurds, but by the socialist Kurds and the other peoples that they gathered around them. If you see Syria, for example, the Syrian nation has been depicted by the Syrian state during this decades as an Arab nation. But that nation is actually not only Arab, because there are many different identities and languages that are spoken and used in Syria, not just the Kurdish languages, also the Armenian language, the Syrian language. There are other languages, there are different religions, there are Sunni and Shia, there are Yazidis, there are Alawite, and so on. There are atheists, there are agnostic people, a lot. So how can you conceive an idea of country, of community, or society that is progressive enough to represent this diversity? And the confederalist movement is using the metaphor of bistane, which in Kurdish means garden. And say in the garden, if you have different flowers of different colors, the best is when these colors are like bright and strong. And the difference between these different colors is not something that is going to create contradictions or create necessarily suffering, but beauty. Whereas, for example, the idea of making all flowers of the same color or all flowers gray in order to be similar to each other is not improving the situation. So the idea of democratic nation is the idea where basically you belong at different levels to one nation that is made of all the differences that come from the sensitiveness of the people, which can be related with language, can be related with lifestyle, or can be related with religion and with faith, but are to be conceived as richnesses in the measure in which they are respecting each other and they are ready to live with each other. And they say that this is the solution for Syria, and I think they are right, because a lot of people in Syria actually want precisely this. Even if the government and other political movements in Syria are advocating for totally different perspectives, but they say this is actually a solution not just for Syria, it's a solution for the Middle East in general. And they say actually that will be the solution for the world as a whole. And it is for many activists that are going to Rojava and coming back sometimes a bit disturbing maybe, but for example in a little book by Abdullah Sharan that is called Precisely Democratic Nation, that I absolutely suggest you to read, he makes also reference to the European Union or to the history of Europe, not to the European Union, but to the history of Europe, also the institutional history of Europe, even in the 20th century, as an example to undertake. I know that it could sound strange to you, but you also have to consider that from a Kurdish perspective, Europe is an exotic place. Like, it's not how Europe we can feel it and we live inside it. Kurdistan is really the most deep Middle Eastern place, so it's very far, not geographically, it's culturally, and as a mindset, it's absolutely far from Europe. And they have this interest in how so many different languages, so many different religious feelings or faiths were eventually able to live together in Europe even after the clash that in the centuries and especially in the 20th century there was in Europe. So this might be also an inspiration to say that we can conceive our own history also in positive terms. So we don't have necessarily to think to the history of Europe as the history of the bad people, the mean people that went all over the world to kill other people and colonize other countries. We can also consider the history of Europe as a plural history, as this dark side, but also has other sides that should be studied more, also the history of our countries in a different perspective, and starting from the value of difference. And also today, the question of the walls and the control of the frontiers, all the migration controversies, this is also a suggestion of how to create a discourse that is organic, and it's not just the refusal, the angry refusal of the policies of our government, but it's also a perspective and a positive proposal for an idea of society that is concrete, is practical, and is based on value the differences and not consider them something wrong. Then for the question of music, yes, it is true that in my book there is a lot about music, but it is because in fact in the history of the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, music played absolutely significant role, especially rock and roll, punk, but also jazz music were extremely important. There is no time now to repeat the whole history, but I will just tell you that the 68 was a year that was very important in the Eastern Bloc as well. And one of the cities that rose up was Warsaw, well, not the city, but the students. The students rose up and were repressed by the police and by the government, also through anti-Semitic lines. But the protest started because a theater show was censored. So that was the real beginning of the Warsaw protest. But the event that actually inspired the rebellion of the youth was something that happened a few months before. It was the concert of the Rolling Stones in Warsaw, and it happened in '67. And for reasons that I tell in the book, basically became a riot, and was the first moment in which the Polish youth actually clashed with the police, and for reasons that they would understand, and that counterposed the mass of the youth with youth of the Communist Party. But then there are many other examples. For example, the Plastic People of the Universe, which was a psychedelic Prague band that was founded actually in the same moment in which the Soviet tanks invaded Czechoslovakia in the streets of Prague. And in that climate, these guys, this youth, created this band that was absolutely apolitical and didn't want to listen or hear anything about politics. And even people were like surprised to see them in the middle of Prague, occupied by the tanks, giving flyers about their concerts. And someone also asked them, how can you, with our nation on its knees, make propaganda for your rock and roll concert? And they answered, the nation might be on its knees, but not us. And that was their attitude that brought them to resist to the fact that they were banned by the government and by the party as much as many other rock and roll bands. They resisted repression. They organized illegal festival in the outskirts of Prague, where they said they would construct a second culture that was alternative to the rhetoric and to the banalities of the first culture, that is the government culture. And then they were arrested in 76 with the members of other similar bands. And these arrests were the event that inspired Václav Havel, the Czech theater writer, to gather more than 200 other intellectuals and writers for the Charta 77 called. That was a paper that was absolutely fundamental in the history of the dissent in the Eastern Bloc, and then was published, by the way, in West Germany on a newspaper in '77, and then was important also to protest against what was called the appeasement between the West and the East. It was, by the way, justified in economical and financial terms, because at that time in the 70s the Soviet bloc was already completely financially dependent from the West. So we also must remember the working class of the East basically worked already for the capitalists of the West, and basically the communist structure of the East were just let's say the interface between the working class of the East and the capitalists of the West. And so basically these rock and roll bands had a role in this, but there are also references that I made to, for example, punk in East Berlin, and there is a movie that I always say in Italy, unfortunately it's only in German, but to you I can say it's a good thing it's in German, and it is Ostpunk. You can also find it on YouTube, and there are these people that were punks in East Berlin and tell their stories and how it was, it was hard to be punk in East Berlin because it meant to face the Stasi beatings at the corner of the Kneipe every night, basically, or even stay 2 or 3 years in the prisons like Bautzen, so are a very hard prison where these people were jailed. In the book, actually, I also speak about the role of punk in West Berlin, because you cannot speak about the 80s in Berlin without mentioning the 87 protests in the May Day in Kreuzberg, or the Lennet Rayek episode and the fleeing of West Berliner dissidents to East Berlin, jumping over the wall on the other direction, and other very interesting stories, like, for example, the Mainzerstrasse and all the anarchy that was actually taking place in East Berlin in 1990, because, of course, the Eastern police has not the credit to intervene on the streets, and so on and so on. But last, I just want to add that there's also another story that is also important, and it's the story of the Cold War of the concerts, and there is also an Arte documentary, you can find it online, about the crazy history. That is the concerts that the West Berlin city organized in '87 and then in '88 in front of the Reichstag to basically provoke the Eastern youth to come to the wall to listen to the concert, hoping that they would clash with the Stasi. And in fact, it was the Stasi that clashed with the youth because they were not so clever in the end. And the youth were already chanting in '87, Gorby, Gorby, referring to Gorbachev and claiming for the destruction of the wall. And then how Honecker and said responded to this challenge, organizing Weissensee concerts with Bryan Adams in the same date in which Michael Jackson would play in West Berlin, or even in the end inviting Bruce Springsteen to play in East Berlin in July '88, and then organizing the concert in a way that would be a concert for Nicaragua without telling Bruce Springsteen, so that when he found out, he was absolutely unhappy with that and said, okay, then I don't come. What is this pro-Nicaragua stuff? Of course, you know, there was the Sandinist government and Reagan was supporting the fascist Contras, so of course Bruce Springsteen was not interested in taking side, and then threat not to make the exhibition in East Berlin. But then, and this is also telling about the mentality of the leaders of East Germany, that they said, okay, don't worry, we'll put aside any reference to Nicaragua, please play. And in fact, they disbanded all the posters for Nicaragua and everything was trashed. Apart that, when Bruce Springsteen came to East Berlin, of course, realized that the tickets that were sold anyway brought the it was written for Nicaragua, and then asked the taxi driver to translate a little note he wrote in German, and he told these few words to this crowd. There was maybe more than 200,000 people, and please go and see also this video online because it's very nice to see the crowd.
So what did he say?
And he said, I'm very happy to be in East Berlin. I didn't come here to play for or against any government. I'm just here to give you rock and roll. And I hope that music will help all barriers to go down. And he said barriers, by the way, because he signed a contract with the GDR that he would never mention the word wall during the concert. And that is true. There was this thing in the contract, so he said barrier, and of course everyone understood. It was not difficult to understand. And the reaction of the crowd was so immense that was also in '88, so it was a few months before the event, and that also is important to to understand what can be the power of music. And even the concert that was in '89, summer '89, in Moscow at the Lenin Stadium, with all the main glam metal and glam rock bands of Hollywood, Motley Crue, Skid Row, Bon Jovi, and even Ozzy Osbourne that had really not just a great show, but also a great speech with the journalist, asking what you think about the Soviet Union, and he said, I think it's terrible, I don't know how people can live in such conditions, they don't have McDonald's, they don't have pizza delivery. Of course he was serious, and you can say he was serious. And by the way, this concert was organized because Gorbachev and his faction in the Communist Party had this prohibitionist policy since '86. They basically banned alcohol from Russia. You can imagine what was the reaction of people. But because actually alcohol was an actual problem for the Soviet society, a big problem. But this kind of repression didn't work. So in '89 already, Gorbachev and the party had come back from this policy, but still they wanted to make like a cultural policy against the abuse of alcohol and drugs, because the war in Afghanistan and the Red Army in Afghanistan had brought a lot of toxicoman soldiers back in the Soviet Union. So there was this problem, but the interesting thing is that they thought that organizing a rock and roll concert in the Lenin Stadium in Moscow could be a good way to educate the youth not to use drugs and alcohol. And in fact, you would not believe it, but again, it is all online, and you can see really the Soviet doctors before the show. There was a crew saying in the microphone before 100,000 people from all Russia, no to drugs, no to alcohol, have a good show, and then leave the stage. But this is a very crazy story, and there is also other crazy reasons for that concert to have happened, but that is in the book. I cannot speak for 1 hour, but sure.
Magda.
So now I can ask you my question. What is the political role today of music?
I'm sorry, it's true that I forgot the main question. As for today, I think the role is anyway very big, and the lesson that the Eastern Bloc movement teaches is that the power of music is immense. So I think that today is very important. I can tell from my experience that more than here in Europe, I saw what is the power of music, for example, in the Arab world. For example, during the so-called Arab Springs, there were a lot of controversies between singers, Moroccan singers, Lebanese singers, women, for example, women that made songs that had lyrics that other people didn't like, or that men considered inappropriate for women. And there are many singers that are in these last years made songs that were controversial as well, because they were actually very misogynistic or macho-oriented. So this actually has a big role, because that is what people talks about. Even when Gaddafi was in Libya confronting the insurgency, he made a famous speech in which, of course, in Arabic, he said to the television, "Who are you? Who are you?" referring to these people that were taking weapons and fighting him. And then, for example, this was remixed in many techno songs that were very mainstream in the discotheques of all the Arab world, like with this "Who are you? Who are you?" Like also representing, of course, a certain distanciation from, also making fun of the leading class of politics. And in the Kurdish movement, music is very important. I can tell you that I was really shocked when I was in Kobani once, and I had to work, and so I was alone in a room, and there was a TV on, and I was on a music channel of Kurdistan, and the Rojava channel, and there was all the morning long these rap songs sung by children, especially female children, that would move a bit dressed like rap stars and move as freestylers and say, "I learn Kurmanji, like I learn Kurdish, I go to school, I learn Kurdish," which is something completely crazy if you see from the perspective of like, imagine like a Los Angeles black student that made rap would never say, "I go and I learn English in school." But that also gives you the idea of how diverse is the way in which music could be powerful. And I don't know what to add on this respect, if not that really I think it is. And of course, maybe one last thing, it is always better for me if this history also of the East tells us something. It's better maybe not to write songs that necessarily are like just a transposition of political essays in lyrics, because that really gives the idea of you want to teach something, you are putting yourself in a position like hierarchical in front of the public. And I think history shows that the masses, especially the youth, like more music that is not directly maybe political, but also incite more rebellion because it is not explicitly ideological. This is just a thought, but thinking of these events of the 80s in Russia or in Eastern Europe inspired this reflection.
Thank you. Other questions? I think there's a big shift that you trace back in your book, because the Prague Spring, the uprising in 1956 in Budapest, were clearly they shared the kind of socialist horizon, at least. Then something happened in the 70s and 80s, and at the end of the 80s, this horizon seems to be gone in Eastern Europe. So I was wondering, whether you could probably say, if you could say something about this kind of shift, which is a huge phenomenon.
Yes, this is in fact important, because in my way, writing this book or studying these things also be like a self-critique, because I realized that not just me, but many people that were involved in social movements or political movements in Western countries in these years, I don't know if you say it like that in English, but we have like such a provincial approach. I don't know if it's a correct word. Meaning that really, normally we think that, for example, the end of the 60s were like the beginning of a big left-wing wave, and the 70s is the core of like a moment in which the left was the future or a real possibility, or socialism, or even communism, or anarchy, I don't know. But if you look more on a global scale, you see that the challenge that the communist movement brought to the capitalist power mainly was exhausted already in the beginning of the 60s, and basically had its last chance in 78 in Prague, and there condemned to death any possibility of rethinking a socialist path. And I'm saying that that was the end because, in fact, what Stalin did in the Soviet Union in the 30s basically already, I think, gave such a potential discredit, or especially inside the Soviet Union, created such a suffering and hatred that basically the project was fucked. But there was the war, and then the liberation of Europe, especially by the Red Army, of course, so that we should never forget. And so in 45, again, socialism seemed to be the possible future, or even a necessary future, even because reconstruction was needed, and so a cooperation between individuals seemed to be necessary. And anyway, the role of the Red Army was so big, and the working class was strong. In that moment, actually, the Soviet Union and the socialist movement at an international level, especially also after the Chinese Revolution of 49, had such a potential of, addressing the humankind. What happened was that after the attempt by Yugoslavia to have their own way to build the socialist society, and not against the Soviet Union, but just maybe dissenting with Stalin about certain specific issues, they were expelled from the Comintern. And then started the last and maybe the most important historical purge that the Stalin section of communism did. And that affected all the Eastern European communist parties, their militants, the intellectuals especially. And that had such a big impact that basically demoralized all the communist movement in Eastern Europe, and again showed to societies that with that kind of movement was not possible to deal, and was not possible to imagine a peaceful and free future. And so basically the 48, that is the date of the beginning of the political clash between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, one could say was the end of the communist experience. And what came later was just like the time in which the communist movement found out that it was in fact exhausted. And if you see in this perspective, you can also see the policy of the Communist Party of China in China and in the Third World Bloc, and also the policy of the Cuban Revolution, and especially of Che Guevara, not as a guerrilla man, but especially as a politician, and all what he did during the 60s around the world, in Egypt, in Algeria, again in the Far East, and so on, trying to give inspiration to a third world movement that would connect itself also with the socialist ideas. There was actually the attempt of this third world communist to revitalize a movement that was already dead. And a defeat of the Guevarist attempt on one side, and the defeat of the Prague Spring on the other, was during the 60s, in fact, the end of the communist idea as a real perspective for the humankind. And then you can see that in the 70s. You can see that in the clash between Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. You can see it in like the clash between African countries supported by the Soviet Union, or all what happened, and all what happened in Eastern Europe, where, for example, the Polish working class that has always protested and struck and clashed with the police during the 60s, always chanting the Internationale and with red flags. During the 70s, shifted toward the clergy, and in the end of the 70s already, was more important than chanting the Internationales was actually the mass that was taking place every day in the factory or the mines that were blocked by the strikers, and the visit of Wojtyła in Poland, one of the major events in the history of the collapse of the socialist bloc. That tells you that, in fact, the 70s were not the core of the history of the revolutionary ideas, unless, again, we see Germany, Italy, or France as the center of the world. But in fact, Europe is not the center of the world, especially was not the center of the world in the second part of the 20th century. It used to be the center of the world in the 19th century, but already in the Cold War, even when there was the construction of the Berlin Wall and the confrontation of the Soviet tanks and the American tanks in Friedrichstrasse, there was Europe at the center as an object, not as a subject. It was already ended the time which Europe was a subject or a subject relevant to European history. So we should really give up to this. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't give value to what happens in Europe, of course, and to the movements of Europe. But maybe we should be more balanced in the future in considering also the chronology and the history of political movements.
Thank you. Dietmar.
Thank you. You said that economic, it's not only the economy, and that other issues also matter a lot, like nation identity or culture. And my question would be, because when you take this two episodes of the fall of the Berlin Wall and later, I would say you could also read it like a perfect example for how the economy matters, in sense like the collapse of the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc was also determined by the collapse of the economic system in the 18th. So everyone could see that the productive forces in the Eastern Bloc are not advancing like in the West, and even more the situation is getting worse. So, but for sure, the people who went on the streets didn't claim in the first matter bread, but freedom issues, also cultural issues. So I would think it's obvious that it's not only the economy, but I think the most interesting question would be not what it could be else, but how they are related, how economy, culture, and these things are related to each other and are intertwined. And if you, my question would be if you have also some thoughts on that.
Maybe we can gather a second question. Anna?
Since you mentioned the visit of the Pope in Poland, I also read the book already, and I have a sentence that you brought there in mind, in which you talking about the regime not showing on TV this big crowd event. You ask how deep is the fear of the people if you're not even able to show their image. So maybe, since I think there are a lot of people knowing also from a mediatic perspective the Berlin Wall, but nowadays a lot of us are not even aware that there are much more walls than there was at the time. Maybe if you can tell something about the censorship or kind of how politics is able to manipulate information.
Yes, as far as economy is concerned, I believe that historically the main factor for the end of the socialist system was economical. And also the rhetoric of liberalism is very much trying to relate everything, for example, to the absence of democracy. But it is also not true, because of course everyone is happier if there is more possibility to take part in the decisions. So of course I'm sure that people were unhappy with the system over there, and by the way we should always remember that it was also in the West a lot of unhappiness, and today as well, about the political system. But what really people in the East could not stand was the economic condition. And that doesn't mean that people would strive. It is not the case. In fact, the case is the opposite, is that from the 50s, both the liberal and the socialist blocs were able to get to the consumption society. And then it was actually, the Cold War was precisely a political war on the access to consumption. So it was not any longer, there were areas in the Soviet Union, especially in Russia or in the Central Asia republics, that also had problem with hunger. But mainly the question was also for the Polish people, for the East Germans, was, okay, we have access to goods, we are not striving, but our goods are less and less developed, less sophisticated than the ones that there are in the West. And this brought basically, especially from the end of the 60s, parallel with some economic reforms that were undertaken first in Yugoslavia, then in Hungary, and then basically in all the East European and even in the Soviet Union, this phenomenon of beginning to get loans from the West, from private actors in the West, especially banks, especially West German banks. And then when these loans basically put the Eastern systems in the situation in which they could not pay the credit any longer, this happened gradually for all the Soviet states and the socialist states already during the 70s, then they had to have the Western government as direct dealers, because it became a political problem. So you need to basically face political confrontation with the government of the West in order to convince the Western banks to give more loans to the Eastern states. And so this was because the access that was already limited to consumption for the Eastern population was basically made possible by this indebtment. And this is another reason why the wall of the Berlin Wall is not so different from the wall of the new walls. So that we should always think of to the Wende as an important phenomenon, but not as a complete change. It's more, we have to deconstruct this opposition between Cold War and the world today. Because we know that today the relationship between states, the relationship of power, are very much related to the debt. And the debt is a political tool as much as it was during the Cold War, and the walls that are built parallel to the borders often really also could be studied as indicators of this kind of economical and political relationships. But in the end, basically, this dynamic of indebtment was not enough to allow the Soviet Union in the first place and the other socialist states to give to the population enough food for what they wanted, basically. So it was a question of desire of the people, and this also question of music is very much a symbol of this, an expression of this. Another thing that we should remember is that the Cold War was also related to the Middle East, and we know that from the late 50s the Soviet Union changed its foreign policy in the Middle East. The Soviet Union was the first and the only state that acknowledged Israel not just de facto but also de jure as an existing state. A few years later, the Soviet Union shifted its foreign policy in favor of the Arab states against Israel. And then when there was the Yom Kippur War in '73 with the oil crisis, the Soviet Union took a big advantage of it because as an oil producer it was not affected by the sanctions of the Arab states, then could export oil a lot to the West, and so kind of also in some way pay the credit of the loans it was getting. By the way, the Soviet Union also sold the oil to the Eastern socialist states, and not always at a good price. And this also is the mentality, of the leadership. It was very short in the perspective. But anyway, to be short, of course, then even today, I was in Potsdam and I talked to a man that was born in the DDR, and I asked him, did you take part in the demonstrations in '89? He said, yes, I did. He's a socialist, he's a left-wing person. And I say, yes, so basically, yeah, because we made these meetings for the Noise Forum in the church, there were so many people and you could not enter in the church. So everyone wanted to take the streets. And I say, so I asked him, but is it true that many were socialists? And he said, well, socialists. We just knew that we could not go on with that kind of system. Of course, we have, maybe many had the socialist values, but economically it was not sustainable. They were tired of, importing even the materials for factories or for working. It was also the frustration of the people, to feel in this feeling of inferiority to the West because you are importing all the materials to work and to produce objects. And then the relationship of this with religion, with nation, nationalist feelings, or with ideologies or whatever kind. Of course, that is the question, because we cannot deny that in the world today there are a lot of economic disaffection in the capitalist system. It's huge, actually, disaffection, even in Europe. The problem is just the right wing is gaining consensus. The right wing is gaining power and consensus from the economical contradictions. In my city in Turin, if you see the map of the last elections, you see all the neighborhoods in the center is voted for the left. The neighborhoods are in a better economical condition. All the suburbs voted for the right. And I don't think it's just my city. I think it's very common nowadays in Europe. So the question is this relation between the objective question of access to consumption, or even to housing, or to whatever health and wealth, with ideology, with culture. That is, I think, what is very simply not addressed at all currently by the left. I think maybe even certain occurrence of Marxism are still present today. I'm not anti-Marxist, but certain assumptions are not working well in making us able to try to think this kind of relation. Because again, sometimes it looks like we are just satisfied with seeing that people are unhappy of their living conditions and think that they will bring to a progressive or even revolutionary evolution. But for example, one clever thing that the Kurdish movement says is that history proved that the economic contradiction don't bring to any revolution. They bring to conflict, yes. They might bring to violence, to clashes, but not to revolution, not to a change. And just basing on this, the political question of the change is not successful. And for the second question about the TV and the role of media in the Cold War and now, the event that you were referring to is significant, and it was precisely when Johannes Paulus II went in '79 to Poland. And in the book I also tell why this man was so important for the Polish people. And then there was a huge crowds everywhere, and not just the quantity of the crowd, but also the attitude of the crowd was really meaningful. Like people crying, people smiling a lot, people being happy, like desperately happy to see a Polish Pope. And that was, of course, the failure of all the cultural policy of the Polish government. And they reacted in this way. They had the monopoly of the shootings of cameras to these events, and they basically portrayed in TV just the Pope speaking, and they never not directed the cameras toward the crowd. And this was absolutely ridiculous, and also, of course, the Western journalists would comment this in a very sarcastic way, like, so basically the Polish people doesn't exist. And in fact, the fact that a movement, the communist movement that was born in order to lead the rising of the people and the rights of the people and bring the people to power, was so scared of the people and the reality of the people they could not even portray the reality of a gathering like that, that was absolutely meaningful. And that also was a representation of his defeat. And what I try to show in the book is that in this world of today, the world of the new worlds, of course many things have changed, but not everything. And I make one example. The destruction of the statue of Saddam Hussein in Baghdad in 2003, that was basically destroyed by US soldiers with armored vehicles, and the statue was connected with the vehicles and was fell apart, and was portrayed in the media at the time, even Italian media, as it was basically a crowd of Iraqis that was happy for the invasion, because the invasion would bring down Saddam Hussein and then brought down the statue. The problem is that there were no Iraqis at this event, and that was also because the Iraqis were scared of the bombardments and were terrified by what would happen, the bombing falling to Baghdad since weeks. And anyway, then we discovered through years that actually many Iraqis were absolutely against their president, but were also against the idea of being occupied by a Western country or by whatever country. And maybe they didn't want a society like the one that George W. Bush imagined. But how was possible for the Western media to give the impression that there was a popular uprising? Because the camera just was directed to the statue and to the people just around it, and let people imagine that around that there was a crowd. And the journalists, I remember in Italy, they openly say that it was a popular film, but you have no proof because no evidence of this. Then I say maybe a socialist regime in the end of the 70s had to hide the people, and a liberal and colonial regime in this new century has to invent a people that doesn't exist. Maybe this is also something that has to do with the question of democracy and the fact that democracy, whatever it is, must always have to do with the presence, anyway, of the people. It could not be something that is imposed by the state.
Masha, do we need to leave now, right? Okay. Thank you, David. Thank you so much.
I think I do say